So what should have happened was this should have been part of the initial planning, what's called a non-combatant evacuation operation, a NEO, which is synchronization between multiple government agencies with the State Department and the Department of Defense taking the lead and planning for the logistics to have lift available for every American that needs it to get out.
American embassies across parts of the Middle East are quietly warning their citizens to consider leaving while flights are still operating. Airlines are already redrawing routes. Military tensions are rising. But for Africa, the real story may not be happening on the battlefield at all. It may be unfolding in the skies and corridors that connect the continent to the rest of the world. But here is the part that many people are not discussing enough. Thousands of African workers, Black expatriates, students and travelers also live and move through these same countries. When evacuation warnings begin circulating, the question is no longer just about Americans leaving. It becomes a broader issue of mobility, safety, and whether Black travelers and African nationals could face the same disruptions if the situation deteriorates. Also, millions of travelers moving in and out of Africa rely on air routes that pass directly through the Gulf. When instability spreads across that region, the consequences do not stay there. They ripple straight into Africa's aviation links, trade corridors, and global connections. So the real question is not simply why Americans are being told to leave. The deeper question is this: why is Africa at the center of this? And why do Black people need to be the ones to move quickly? Let's find out. The first real signal that something serious was unfolding did not come from explosions or televised announcements. It appeared quietly inside official notices, updates issued by American embassies and the U.S. State Department advising citizens across parts of the Middle East to consider leaving while commercial travel options still exist. On the surface, travel advisories are not unusual. Governments update them frequently when security conditions change. But the tone of this one immediately caught the attention of people who follow geopolitical patterns closely. The language was unusually cautious. Americans were encouraged to review their security plans, avoid unnecessary travel, and prepare for the possibility that the situation could change quickly. In several places, the message emphasized leaving while flights and transportation networks remain operational. That wording matters. Diplomatic warnings are written carefully, and phrases about departing while travel options still exist usually signal that officials believe future mobility could become restricted.
Again, I just laid out for you that there have been plans in place and that the State Department has been very clear to the American people traveling within this region not to travel to these regions. We gave notices to leave immediately the countries where these Americans were within. And unlike the previous administration, we actually have a number. We actually have identified the number of people in the region who have requested help. We are in direct contact and engagement with them. And you have to keep in mind, there's a few thousand people who have requested assistance to come home in comparison to the millions who we understand are in the region. So we will help every single American who wants to come home if they're making that request of the State Department.
Behind that warning sits a rapidly escalating confrontation involving Iran and the United States. Over the past few days, military tensions have intensified across the region. Missile launches and retaliatory threats have pushed multiple governments into heightened alert. Strategic assets have been repositioned, military systems activated, and regional security calculations recalibrated. None of this necessarily means a full regional war is inevitable, but it does mean governments are preparing for a scenario in which the situation deteriorates faster than civilian transportation systems can adapt. When that risk appears, the priority for governments is simple: reduce the number of civilians who might be caught in a conflict zone. This is why evacuation-style advisories often emerge before the most dramatic moments of a crisis. Diplomatic planners know that once a conflict expands, airports can close overnight, airspace can become restricted, and travel routes can disappear with little warning. By encouraging citizens to leave early, governments attempt to avoid the logistical nightmare of emergency evacuations later.
Instability in the Middle East is now something of a contagion. Thousands of Americans are trying to evacuate. Their frustrations and the reliability of guidance from the U.S. government was front and center at today's White House briefing. the first since this war began.
But the travel warnings themselves are only one piece of the story. Because as soon as geopolitical tensions intensify in the Middle East, another system immediately begins reacting: the global aviation network. And this matters especially for Black travelers and African migrants, who rely heavily on the same transit routes through the Gulf to reach Europe, Asia, or North America. When those corridors become unstable, the impact is felt far beyond the Middle East itself. Airlines do not wait for official declarations of war before adjusting their operations. Instead, they constantly evaluate the safety of the skies through which their aircraft travel. If missile launches, military radar activity, or potential airspace closures appear near a major corridor, airlines begin rerouting flights long before the public fully understands why. These decisions are often made quietly by aviation risk analysts, security teams, and air traffic authorities working behind the scenes. And this particular region matters more than most. The Middle East sits at one of the busiest crossroads in global aviation. Flights connecting Europe, Africa, Asia, and North America frequently pass through or near this airspace. Every day, hundreds of long-haul aircraft rely on these corridors to move passengers and cargo between continents. So when governments start warning citizens to leave the region, aviation planners begin asking a different question entirely. If the skies over the Gulf become uncertain, what happens to the routes that connect the rest of the world? If the skies over the Gulf become uncertain, the global aviation system does not wait for confirmation. It reacts immediately. Airlines operate in an environment where safety calculations are constant. Every flight plan is built around risk assessments that consider weather patterns, political tensions, military activity, and airspace restrictions. When a region suddenly becomes volatile, those calculations change overnight. The Middle East is one of the most sensitive zones in this system because it lies directly along the shortest paths connecting Europe, Asia, and large parts of Africa. The moment the confrontation between Iran and its adversaries intensified, aviation authorities began monitoring the region more closely. Missile launches and military exercises are not only dangerous for the countries involved, they also create unpredictable conditions in the skies. A commercial aircraft flying through contested airspace cannot assume that radar systems will interpret it correctly, or that military forces will distinguish it instantly from potential threats. History has already shown how dangerous that situation can become. When military tensions collide with civilian aviation corridors, the risk of tragic mistakes rises dramatically. Because of that, airlines prefer to reroute early, rather than take chances later. Rerouting flights may sound simple, but in practice, it reshapes entire networks. Long-distance aircraft are designed to follow the most efficient path between 2 points on the globe, usually a curved route across continents known as a Great Circle path. When a key corridor becomes unsafe, those carefully calculated routes must be redrawn. Aircraft may need to fly hundreds or even thousands of kilometers farther than usual. That means more fuel consumption, longer flight times, and increased operational costs. Airlines must adjust schedules, crew rotations, and airport slots. Some flights become economically unviable and are temporarily canceled. Others are redirected through alternative corridors that can handle the traffic. This is where the significance of the Middle East becomes clear. The region is not just another piece of airspace. It functions as one of the central bridges of modern aviation. Massive transit hubs like Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi were built precisely because of their location between continents. These hubs are also major gateways used by African students, workers, and diaspora communities traveling between continents, which means any disruption in this region immediately affects how millions of Black travelers move across the world. From these cities, airlines can connect travelers from Africa to Asia, Europe to Australia, and the Americas to South Asia with remarkable efficiency. Every day, millions of passengers pass through these airports, transferring from one flight to another as part of a vast global web of movement. But when instability threatens the airspace surrounding those hubs, the structure of that web begins to shift. Flights that normally pass through the Gulf may be diverted northward or southward. Cargo routes may follow entirely different paths. Passengers who once relied on a single connection suddenly find themselves traveling through unfamiliar airports. And when airlines start searching for alternative corridors that can safely link continents, geography begins to reveal something interesting. Because if the traditional aviation bridge between East and West becomes unstable, the next logical routes start appearing on a different part of the world map. A continent positioned between major oceans, sitting along the pathways that connect Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Which raises an unexpected possibility. If global air traffic begins adjusting its routes, could Africa's location suddenly place it closer to the center of the aviation map than many people realize? If global air traffic begins adjusting its routes, the answer lies in a map most people rarely examine closely. When people think about international travel, they usually imagine Europe, North America, or the Gulf states as the central points connecting the world. But aviation planners see the planet very differently. They look at geography through corridors, lines that aircraft can follow efficiently while connecting continents with the least distance and risk. When those corridors shift, the importance of certain regions changes immediately. Take a globe and trace the shortest paths between Europe and Southern Africa, or between the Americas and Asia. Many of those routes pass close to African airspace, or along the edges of the continent's coastline. Africa sits between the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, forming a natural bridge between three major regions of the world. For decades, this position was underutilized in aviation because other hubs developed earlier and captured most connecting traffic. European airports handled intercontinental travel from the north, while the Gulf states built powerful transit hubs to the east. But geography has never changed. The continent remained exactly where it has always been, between global pathways that link entire hemispheres. When instability disrupts established hubs, airlines begin revisiting those geographical realities. They ask a practical question. If traditional corridors become complicated or risky, which locations can safely connect the same regions with minimal deviation? And when planners study that question on a world map, Africa suddenly becomes difficult to ignore. Several cities across the continent already function as important connectors. Addis Ababa has grown into one of the largest aviation hubs in Africa, linking dozens of destinations across the continent with routes extending to Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Nairobi plays a similar role in East Africa, serving as a gateway between African cities and Asian markets. Cairo connects North Africa with the Mediterranean and the Middle East, while Johannesburg anchors long-distance travel in the southern part of the continent. These airports were built to serve regional needs, but their geographic positions give them potential far beyond that. If airlines begin searching for stable corridors outside volatile regions, these hubs can absorb additional traffic. Flights traveling between continents could include African stopovers instead of relying exclusively on Gulf transit points. Cargo networks moving goods between Asia and the Atlantic world might also adjust their pathways. This shift does not happen overnight. Aviation systems are complex, and airlines carefully evaluate infrastructure, political stability, and operational capacity before making major adjustments. But history shows that moments of geopolitical disruption often accelerate changes that were already possible. The rise of Gulf aviation hubs themselves followed a similar pattern. Strategic investment, stable conditions, and favorable geography allowed those cities to transform into global crossroads within a few decades. Africa's growing aviation infrastructure suggests that a comparable evolution may now be underway. And once aviation planners begin studying Africa's geographic advantages, they often notice something else. The same position that makes the continent valuable for air routes also places it near some of the most important maritime trade corridors on Earth. Which leads to another question. If instability in the Middle East begins affecting not just airspace, but energy markets and shipping lanes as well, how might Africa's position along those global trade routes change the strategic conversation entirely? Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel. You're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. If tensions in the Middle East continue to affect transportation corridors in the air, the next system that reacts is usually the one carrying goods across oceans. The global economy does not run only on airplanes. It runs on ships, pipelines, and energy routes that move enormous volumes of fuel and commodities every single day. And when military confrontation appears near the Persian Gulf, those routes immediately come under scrutiny. The Gulf region sits beside one of the most important maritime choke points in the world, the Strait of Hormuz. A significant portion of the planet's oil exports passes through that narrow channel before moving toward Asia, Europe, and other markets. Whenever geopolitical tensions rise in that area, traders, shipping companies, and governments begin calculating the possibility that those routes could become disrupted. Even rumors of interference with tanker traffic can send signals through global markets. Oil prices react. Insurance premiums for ships increase. Shipping companies reconsider how and where their vessels move through potentially dangerous waters. These reactions are not necessarily caused by a full blockade or direct attacks. They often happen simply because the possibility of disruption exists. Energy markets are extremely sensitive to risk. If tankers hesitate to pass through certain areas, alternative supply chains must be considered. Some routes become longer as ships take wider paths around high-risk zones. Others rely more heavily on storage reserves or alternative export terminals located outside the immediate conflict region. For African economies, fluctuations in energy markets can have immediate consequences. Many countries across the continent rely on imported refined fuel or petroleum products that travel through international shipping networks connected to the Middle East. When prices move sharply, transportation costs increase, and that change spreads through entire economies, from freight and logistics to food prices and industrial production. But the story does not end with vulnerability. The same global shipping map that carries oil from the Gulf also runs along the coasts of Africa. Trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and the Americas pass through waters near the continent's northern and eastern shores before moving toward the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean. These corridors have been used for centuries, long before modern aviation or digital logistics networks existed. When instability appears near traditional choke points, shipping planners begin reassessing how those corridors function. Ports located along strategic maritime pathways suddenly receive more attention from shipping companies seeking reliable stops for refueling, cargo transfers, and logistical support. Africa sits directly beside several of those pathways. The Red Sea connects the Mediterranean world to the Indian Ocean. The Suez Canal funnels enormous amounts of trade past North Africa. Further south, the waters near the Horn of Africa link Asian shipping routes with markets across Europe and the Atlantic. Down the continent's eastern and western coasts, maritime highways carry container ships, bulk cargo vessels, and energy tankers between hemispheres. As global trade networks adapt to new risks, these routes become even more strategically significant. And when analysts begin examining those routes more carefully, they realize that the continent's geographic position does more than simply place it along trade corridors. It places Africa at a crossroads where air routes, shipping lanes, and energy pathways intersect. Which raises the next question. If global systems start adjusting simultaneously, aviation routes above the continent and maritime trade lanes beside it, could Africa's role in the international system begin to shift in ways few people have fully anticipated? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. If global aviation routes above Africa and maritime trade lanes beside it begin attracting more attention, the next shift happens in something less visible, but equally important: strategic confidence. In moments of geopolitical tension, governments and corporations begin searching for regions that offer predictability. Stability becomes a resource in its own right. Airlines want reliable airspace. Shipping companies want secure ports. Energy markets want dependable transit routes. And investors start looking for locations that can function as anchors in a turbulent system. This is where Africa's broader transformation begins to matter. Over the past decade, many African countries have been investing heavily in infrastructure designed to connect the continent internally and internationally. New airports, expanded seaports, modernized rail corridors, and digital logistics platforms have gradually strengthened Africa's ability to participate more actively in global trade networks. At the same time, continental initiatives such as the African Continental Free Trade Area have been working to make the movement of goods and services across African borders easier. These changes did not attract dramatic global headlines at first. infrastructure development rarely does. But when external crises begin disrupting long-standing global corridors, the value of those improvements suddenly becomes more visible. Airlines examining alternative routes need airports capable of handling increased traffic. Cargo networks require ports equipped to manage large container volumes. Shipping companies prefer locations where political stability allows operations to continue without sudden interruptions. Each of these factors contributes to a larger calculation. Where can global systems rely on continuity? Africa's geography already places it between major oceans and along key air pathways. Now, the continent's infrastructure is slowly catching up with that geographical advantage. Modern ports in countries such as Morocco, Kenya, South Africa, and Egypt have expanded their capacity to serve international shipping. Airports across the continent have upgraded terminals, runways, and logistics facilities to support growing passenger numbers. Rail projects linking inland markets to coastal ports are gradually improving the movement of goods across vast regions. When viewed individually, these projects look like national development initiatives. But when viewed together, they begin to resemble something larger, a network forming across the continent. Moments of global uncertainty often reveal the importance of such networks. If airlines must reroute flights, they need airports prepared to handle new passenger flows. If shipping routes adjust, ports must absorb changing cargo volumes. If energy markets shift supply patterns, infrastructure must support alternative transportation paths. In other words, stability combined with capability becomes extremely valuable. For Africa, this moment could represent more than simply responding to external disruptions. It could accelerate a process that has already begun, transforming the continent from a peripheral participant in global logistics into an increasingly important connector between regions. But that transformation also raises a deeper strategic question. Because whenever global systems begin to reorganize around new corridors and stable partners, political relationships tend to evolve alongside them. And if Africa's geographic position, infrastructure investments, and growing economic networks start attracting more global attention, the next issue becomes unavoidable. How will the continent use that rising strategic importance when the world begins treating it not just as a destination, but as a central node in the global system? If Africa's geography, infrastructure, and trade corridors are beginning to attract new strategic attention, then the real shift is not happening in airports or shipping lanes alone. It is happening in how the world starts thinking about the continent itself. For decades, global strategy was built around a handful of established centers. Europe handled major aviation flows from the north. The Gulf states developed powerful transit hubs connecting east and west. Asia dominated manufacturing routes. Africa, in that structure, was often treated as a destination for trade rather than a connector shaping it. But global systems are rarely permanent. They evolve whenever disruptions expose weaknesses in the old arrangements. The current tensions in the Middle East are doing exactly that. A region that became one of the world's most important transportation bridges is now experiencing uncertainty. Governments are issuing travel advisories. Airlines are recalculating routes. Energy markets are adjusting to new risks. These developments may stabilize again in time, but the disruption itself forces planners, investors, and policymakers to examine alternative pathways. And that examination leads directly to Africa's position on the world map. Look at the globe from a strategic perspective rather than a political one. Africa sits between the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, touching trade lanes that move goods between Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Air corridors crossing the southern hemisphere pass close to the continent's airspace. Maritime routes linking multiple continents curve around their coasts. The geography that once seemed peripheral suddenly appears central when traditional hubs become uncertain. At the same time, African countries are not standing still. Infrastructure expansion, regional trade agreements, and growing aviation networks are slowly strengthening the continent's ability to participate more actively in global logistics. Cities like Addis Ababa, Nairobi, Cairo, and Johannesburg are building reputations as regional connectors. Ports along the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Atlantic coast are expanding capacity to handle international shipping. When global systems begin searching for stability, these developments start to matter more. This does not mean the world's entire logistical architecture will suddenly pivot overnight. Established hubs will continue operating, and geopolitical tensions often cool as quickly as they rise. But crises have a way of revealing possibilities that were previously underestimated. They force decision-makers to reconsider assumptions about which regions matter most in maintaining the flow of people, goods, and energy. And in moments like this, Africa's long-overlooked strategic position becomes harder to ignore. The evacuation advisories that began this story are a symptom of something larger, a reminder that global networks depend on stability in specific places. When those places face uncertainty, the search for alternative corridors begins. Air routes shift, shipping lanes adjust, investment flows toward regions capable of providing reliable connections between continents. That process is already underway in small ways. Flights are being rerouted, energy markets are recalibrating, analysts are studying maps with fresh attention. And each of those adjustments quietly points toward the same realization that the world's geography offers more than one way to connect continents. For Africa, this moment is less about the crisis itself and more about what it reveals. The continent is no longer simply observing global events from the sidelines. Its position, infrastructure, and growing economic networks mean that decisions made elsewhere increasingly intersect with African systems and opportunities. Which brings us back to the question many Black viewers may be asking right now. If governments are already advising their citizens to leave while travel routes remain open, should African nationals, Black expatriates, and diaspora communities also start paying closer attention to what is unfolding? Let us know in the comments section. How is Africa going to respond? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.